In October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war as the United States discovered Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba, just 90 miles from its shores. For 13 tense days, President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a high-stakes standoff, each side weighing the consequences of escalation. Through intense negotiations and a secret agreement, the crisis was diffused, leaving a lasting legacy on global diplomacy and the fragile balance of power. What if I told you that on October 27, 1962, a single Soviet submarine commander nearly triggered World War III with one torpedo? Deep beneath the Caribbean Sea, Captain Nikolai Shumkov of the Soviet submarine B-59 was losing his mind. Cut off from Moscow for days, bombarded by American depth charges, his nuclear-armed vessel was running out of oxygen. His crew was suffocating. The temperature inside had reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were fainting at their posts. And Shumkov had the power to launch a nuclear torpedo that would vaporize the American ships above. All he needed was approval from two other officers. This wasn't just another Cold War standoff. This was the moment humanity balanced on a knife's edge, and most people didn't even know it was happening. The trap is set. The Cuban Missile Crisis didn't begin with dramatic confrontations or military parades. It started with a lie and a photograph. On October 14, 1962, Major Richard Heiser piloted his U-2 spy plane over western Cuba on what seemed like a routine reconnaissance mission. What his cameras captured would change everything. Clear evidence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles under construction, just 90 miles from American shores. These weren't defensive weapons. They were nuclear-tipped missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C., New York, and half the continental United States within minutes. President John F. Kennedy had been played. Just 6 weeks earlier, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin had looked him in the eye and sworn that Moscow would never place offensive weapons in Cuba. Meanwhile, Nikita Khrushchev had been secretly shipping nuclear missiles across the Atlantic in what he codenamed Operation Anadir, a masterpiece of deception involving fake grain shipments and military advisors posing as agricultural specialists. But why Cuba? Why risk nuclear war over a Caribbean island? The answer lay in the brutal mathematics of nuclear deterrence. America had Jupiter missiles in Turkey, pointed directly at Soviet cities. The U.S. held overwhelming nuclear superiority, a 17-to-1 advantage in deliverable warheads. Khrushchev, the peasant's son who had clawed his way to the top of the Soviet hierarchy, refused to appear weak before his own hardliners. Cuba was his trump card, a way to level the playing field in one bold stroke. The War Room. When Kennedy's advisors first saw those surveillance photos on October 16th, the room fell silent. These grainy black and white images represented a fundamental shift in the global balance of power. The missiles in Cuba could kill 80 million Americans in the first exchange. What followed were the most intense 13 days in human history. Kennedy assembled his executive committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, a collection of brilliant minds who would debate the fate of civilization behind closed doors. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, the Ford Motor Company whiz kid who thought he could quantify warfare, pushed for a naval blockade. General Curtis LeMay, the cigar-chomping architect of the bombing campaigns against Japan, demanded immediate airstrikes. "This is almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich," LeMay thundered, comparing Kennedy to Neville Chamberlain. But it was Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's younger brother and closest advisor, who understood the stakes most clearly. "If we attack Cuba," he warned, "we're going to have to attack the Soviet Union, and then we have a nuclear war." Here's what the public didn't know. Kennedy was receiving contradictory intelligence reports. Soviet ships were still heading toward Cuba, and American military commanders were secretly pushing for a first strike. The pressure was suffocating. Kennedy had been in office less than 2 years, and his credibility was already damaged by the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Republicans were calling him weak on communism. His own generals were questioning his resolve. The 42-year-old president was trapped between appearing weak and starting a nuclear war. The point of no return. On October 22nd, Kennedy went on national television. 65 million Americans watched as their young president, his face grave with the weight of knowledge, announced the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba. The world was officially on the brink. "It shall be the policy of this nation," Kennedy declared, "to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." The naval quarantine, Kennedy's lawyers insisted they couldn't call it a blockade, which would be an act of war, went into effect immediately. American destroyers formed a ring around Cuba. B-52 bombers carrying nuclear weapons began continuous airborne patrols. The Strategic Air Command moved to Defense Condition 2, one step short of nuclear war. In Moscow, Khrushchev was facing his own impossible choices. His missiles weren't even operational yet. Soviet technicians were still frantically installing nuclear warheads, while American spy planes circled overhead. His advisors were split between those who wanted to back down and hardliners who saw this as the perfect opportunity to humble the Americans once and for all. The world held its breath. Saturday, October 27th, Armageddon's doorstep. If October 22nd was when the crisis went public, October 27th was when it nearly went nuclear. The day began with a Soviet surface-to-air missile shooting down Major Rudolf Anderson's U-2 spy plane over Cuba, killing the pilot instantly. American military leaders saw this as an act of war. They demanded immediate retaliation, but the real drama was happening beneath the waves. Soviet submarine B-59, armed with a nuclear torpedo, had been stalked by American destroyers for hours. Captain Shumkov and his crew were beyond exhaustion. They had lost radio contact with Moscow and had no idea whether war had already begun. When American ships began dropping depth charges, meant as warning signals, the Soviet crew interpreted them as attacks. In the suffocating heat of the submarine, 3 men held the fate of humanity in their hands. Captain Shumkov wanted to fire the nuclear torpedo. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov agreed, but Deputy Officer Captain Vasily Arkhipov refused to give his consent. One man, one decision, the difference between civilization and nuclear winter. Arkhipov convinced his colleagues to surface and radio Moscow for instructions. It was perhaps the most important no in human history, spoken by a man whose name most people have never heard. The secret deal. While the world watched Kennedy and Khrushchev in their public chess match, the real negotiations were happening in secret. Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin met with Robert Kennedy in the Attorney General's office on the evening of October 27th. The conversation lasted less than an hour, but it saved the world. The deal was elegant in its simplicity. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. In exchange, America would publicly pledge never to invade Cuba and secretly remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months. Khrushchev accepted the next morning, October 28th. The crisis was over. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Neither leader wanted this confrontation. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were moderates trying to manage their own hardliners while avoiding nuclear war. They succeeded not through strength or weakness, but through the kind of quiet diplomacy that rarely makes headlines. The reckoning. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended not with victory parades or triumphant speeches, but with mutual relief and a sobering recognition of how close humanity had come to extinction. Both superpowers installed direct communication lines, the famous hotline, to prevent future misunderstandings. The Limited Test Ban Treaty followed in 1963, marking the beginning of nuclear arms control. Kennedy emerged from the crisis as a mature leader who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when not to use your power. Khrushchev, despite achieving his strategic goals, was seen by his colleagues as having backed down to the Americans. Within 2 years, he would be removed from power. But the real lesson of those 13 days in October wasn't about politics or military strategy. It was about the terrifying fragility of peace in the nuclear age, where individual decisions by submarine commanders and presidents alike could determine whether civilization survived another day. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended 62 years ago, but its shadow still looms over us. In a world where 9 nations possess nuclear weapons and tensions continue to simmer from Ukraine to Taiwan, the ghost of Captain Arkhipov reminds us that sometimes the most heroic act is simply saying no. Today, as we face new global challenges, we might remember that October morning when 2 superpowers stepped back from the brink. Not because they were weak, but because they were wise enough to understand that some games are too dangerous to play.